If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
I used to give speeches on the title, Do Women Have Human Rights? Over and over again, I'd be asked to answer the question, do women have human rights? And to me, this was so bizarre because I'm sitting in the room with all these people, could be the State Department, could be some diplomatic lunch, could be a gigantic human rights meeting, and I have to answer a question, do women have human rights? I used to say, excuse me, but last I checked, I'm human. So I think it's sort of self-evident. But the stunning thing was it wasn't self-evident. So
what exactly are women's rights? How are these rights protected? And how do we know when the rights of women are being violated? Women's rights are essentially human rights, so for example, the right to freedom from torture. The fact that this is still being contested is testament to the fact that the campaign for women's rights has historically been a struggle. One of the main complexities of promoting women's rights is the role that women play in reproduction. Each time a baby is born in the world, there was a woman who carried that child around for 40 weeks, and this is not an easy task. It is especially difficult for women in developing countries who do not have access to a lot of essential facilities and information. The enforcement of women's rights is complex. Originally, gender equality was addressed by the United Nations Treaty, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It became obvious later on that the enforcement of women's rights must be given special consideration, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women was adopted in 1979. Signatories to CEDAW are, under international law, obligated to amend their legislation to protect the rights of women on an equal basis with men, and to abolish any practices that discriminate against women. An example of legislative change in an individual state is the Australian Sex Discrimination Act. It is difficult to record all violations against women. In countries where violations occur frequently, it is unlikely that women have access to officials who can help them and also record the abuses that have occurred. Estimates of violence against women worldwide are said to be the minimum amount of instances that have occurred, as so many women do not have the opportunity or courage to report what has happened to them. So why has the promotion of women's rights been such a struggle? Firstly, women are absent from the decision-making processes that determine such rights. Their voices are not heard or ignored, and the changes that are made are not specific to actual needs of women. There is a distinct lack of funding for organisations dedicated to women's rights, and thus these organisations are not as effective as they could be. Traditionally, women retain the role of primary care of the family. Even when women are employed, this role at home is not reduced, and women are performing 2 jobs, but only get paid for 1. Women's opinions are often marginalised or ignored. If one woman is brave enough to speak out about something that is happening to her and other women, her opinion is easily disregarded as a minority view. Women are born unique. Some want children, some are homosexual, some want to study at university, and some are less able-bodied than others. International law reduces women to a collective and does not address the individual differences of women. Women's rights are not easily protected in the private realm. Legally, it is a criminal act to hit a woman, but these rights are not easily realised at home. So what if we give the stick woman the opportunity to apply for a job? If she is from one of the least developed countries, she has very few marketable skills, and will likely need consideration should she become pregnant. In comparison, the average man in the same country is better qualified and has a much better chance of being literate. Of the 2 candidates, who would you hire? If this little stick girl was lucky enough to attend school, she is still faced with social and family constraints, and school practices and policies that will hinder her academic progress. But let's say this little stick girl grows into a stick woman who has managed to graduate. Her education is essentially worthless if she does not have the opportunity to apply for jobs because she is a woman. And even if she gets the job, she is unlikely to be paid as much as her male counterpart for the same work. In order to achieve equal status to men, and to protect women from human rights violations, women's rights activists have to combat these problems and more, which is why women's rights have been such a struggle to promote and enforce. And legal change is not enough. Social and economic norms must be challenged.
Sasa leo mama anasema pana. Wale watetezi saa zingine wafikishage habari yangu. Kumbe acha peke yangu nisimame mimi mwanamke niende nikajitetee ili nipate usalama, kwa maana mama anateseka, mama anapakwa, mama njiko nakimbia na vitu kukichwa. Mwanamke amesumbuka sana. Amesumbuka sana, mwanamke anaomba amani. Mama naomba amani.
It would occur often that I would be abused in the chicken house. because it was far removed and it was isolated and there was no one there except me and the chickens. And where I would be fondled or rubbed against, the fleas would cover my hands and I couldn't move.
Women's rights violations do not always pertain to violence and physical abuse. Women's rights are for the most part the ability of women to participate in all aspects of life with the same freedom as a man would. Such rights, as stipulated by the CEDAW framework, include the equality of men and women before the law, using the same criteria to judge the academic work of men and women, paying men and women the same amount for the same work, including women in sporting and cultural activities and competitions, the right to adequate living conditions, the right to entering marriage willingly, the right to decide whether to produce children. NIAF Riley symptomizes as well the low status of women, economically, socially, culturally, and politically, both constitutes and enables the further denial of human rights in gender-specific ways, often at the hands of family members, male and female. This will be discussed later on in more detail, but it's important to note that data about the progress of women's rights is difficult to acquire, even by the United Nations. But what progress has been made to reduce the number of human rights violations against women? To answer this question, one of the more accurate sources of data, the World's Women Report of 2010, will be used. Slight progress is being made in the improvement of female literacy rates, but gender disparities in adult literacy rates are still high worldwide. Enrollment in primary schools is increasing for both boys and girls. However, girls represent 54% of the 72 million children not attending school. Enrollment in secondary school is increasing at a lower rate than in primary schools, and a large gender gap persists at this level of education. Currently, there are more women than men enrolled in tertiary education. Women are grossly underrepresented in the disciplines of science and engineering. 52% of women are participants in the labour market, marking no significant change from the 1990s. The gender pay gap is prevalent worldwide. Women remain the primary care at home. Women are still underrepresented in decision-making processes. Just 7 of 150 heads of state are female, and just 11 of 192 heads of government. Female genital mutilation rates are declining, but this remains a prevalent issue. In the majority of African countries and 50% of Asian countries, women are excluded from property rights. In developing regions, married women retain very little control in their own households. Women's rights progress seems slow, and as previously discussed, is difficult to implement for a variety of reasons. The UN World's Women Report details small but sure signs of improvement. Critics of women's rights argue that certain groups of women are especially vulnerable to violations, including Indigenous women and homosexual women. Women's rights abuses occur in both developing and developed countries, with Afghani women reporting an increase of sexual and physical violence following the Taliban regime, and 42% of Australian women reporting physical violence by a previous partner. 35 to 40% of Zambian women report intimate partner violence, and 20% of English homeless women were forced to leave their homes because of violence.
We can talk about this. We won't die. We can be survivors. We can empower each other as women. And there have been moments along the way where I stand up and I say, this is who I am and this is what I survived. And maybe there's a little girl there that gets a little bit of courage.
The catalyst for every instance of change in the history of women's rights is difficult to isolate. As previously mentioned, acknowledging and enforcing women's legal rights does not necessarily facilitate change. Evidence suggests that social, political, and economic participation must be addressed simultaneously in order to most effectively implement women's rights. In certain instances of improvement, it remains unclear as to whether this effect is due to the promotion of women's rights or the promotion of human rights in general. In these instances, men's living standards have improved simultaneously, indicating that while improvements have been made to the lives of both males and females, gender inequality persists. There is a claim that while human rights activists have long struggled to promote the human rights of women, the scale of human rights violations against women is unprecedented. First, I would argue that without the support of accurate data pertaining to women's rights violations, this claim lacks evidence. Since 1995, the Campaign for Women's Rights has desperately needed more accurate data so that the progress of women worldwide can be reliably monitored. This issue of sufficient and accurate data is very concerning even today. As part of CEDAW's requirements, signatories to the treaty must provide timely reports on the progress of women's rights, and a number of countries continuously fail to do so. Anne Thompson argues that insufficient data detailing births and deaths mean that determining a process or project as an improvement to the lives of women is impossible without first calculating the scope of the problem. Sensitive issues, such as sexual violence against women, is particularly difficult to record, as many providers of healthcare for these women have not been trained to initiate such a conversation. Shame often inhibits women from sharing unwanted sexual experiences, and without prompting, it is unknown how many women worldwide have kept such burdens secret. Furthermore, the reason why there is an unprecedented scale of human rights violations today is because unjust acts against women are finally being recognised as human rights abuses. Prior to CEDAW and other treaties focusing on women's rights, the abuse of women, forced sex in marriage, physical violence, female infanticide, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, the exclusion of girls from schools, slavery, forced sex work, unequal pay, torture, were not necessarily thought of as human rights, but as cultural and social norms. Today, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. And whether this is actually the case worldwide does not compromise this statement, as the acceptance of the inalienable rights of women alone means that the abuse of young girls, women, mothers, grandmothers do not go unrecognised. The scale of human rights violations against women is unprecedented because the world is finally recognising these violations as the criminal acts they are, and are treating them as such. In some areas, women are experiencing a decrease in life quality, but in most areas, women's rights are slowly but surely advancing. The data that serves as evidence for this progress is not as sufficient as it should be, but there is more data today about the human rights abuses of women than there has ever been.
Even today, there are those who are trying to silence our words. But the voices of this conference and of the women at YRO must be heard loudly and clearly. It is a violation of human rights when babies are denied food or drowned or suffocated or their spines broken simply because they are born girls.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever.
I'm a lucky person to have been raised in a family where boys and girls were treated equally, which was not normal. People have been describing me as too tough, not with enough humor, for instance. I think this is a description of the fact that when a woman is a leader, she seems to people, it's kind of subconsciously they're not aware of why, but nobody reacts, in a special way if a man has to make a difficult decision and be tough in some kind of way because decisions have to be made.
In conclusion, the fact that women's rights violations are being recognised as human rights violations and recorded is an advance in the campaign for women's rights. If the scale of women's rights violations is unprecedented, this does not necessarily reflect badly on the movement to ensure the equal rights of women. It just means that women's rights violations are finally being recognised as violations against women as human beings. The women's rights movement is not over. Women do not yet have the same opportunities as men worldwide, and the current rate at which equality is being achieved is slow. But we have achieved so much progress, and the information is available to us, both men and women, to ensure the equality of all genders, once and for all.